May 17th, 1885. Cobh Harbour, County Cork, Ireland. The harbour master's telescope catches something wrong with the vessel approaching from the Atlantic. The SS Erin's Hope should be entering port with 347 souls aboard, Irish emigrants bound for new lives in Boston who'd been turned back by American quarantine officials. But the ship moves strangely. No one stands at the helm, no passengers line the rails, the sails hang slack and torn. When the harbour pilot boards the drifting vessel, he finds the decks empty, completely, impossibly empty. 347 passengers gone, 22 crew members, vanished. The only movement comes from below deck, thousands of rats, sleek and fat, scurrying through abandoned belongings. In the captain's quarters, a logbook lies open. The final entry, dated May 3rd, reads, "The rats know something we don't. They're the only ones not getting sick." But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Cobh Emigrant Ship rats, 1885 Coffin ship returned to port. Only Rodents survived Typhus. The plague vessel's sole survivors, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're bringing you forgotten chapters of history that textbooks won't touch. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers scattered across the globe. Now, let's step back to 1885 Ireland, where desperation, disease, and the Atlantic Ocean created the perfect conditions for one of maritime history's most disturbing mysteries. Ireland in 1885 exists in the shadow of catastrophe. The Great Famine ended decades earlier, but its ghost still haunts every village, every family, every conversation about the future. The population has never recovered from the million deaths and million more emigrants who fled during those dark years. Now, in the mid-1880s, a new agricultural crisis grips the island. Crop failures spread across the western counties. Land wars pit tenant farmers against absentee landlords. Evictions become commonplace again. Cobh, then still known by its English name Queenstown, serves as Ireland's primary immigration port. The town clings to the southern shore of Great Island in Cork Harbour, its colorful row houses climbing the steep hillside above the water. From this harbour, more than 5 million Irish emigrants departed for America between 1848 and 1950. In 1885 alone, over 60,000 souls passed through Cobh, desperate to escape poverty, hunger, and hopelessness. The town thrives on this human traffic. Boarding houses pack emigrants into cramped rooms during their final nights in Ireland. Merchants sell provisions for the journey: salt pork, hardtack, dried fruit. Money changers convert British pounds to American dollars. Unscrupulous agents sell fraudulent tickets or steer naive travelers toward the worst vessels. The desperation of the emigrants makes them easy prey. St. Colman's Cathedral overlooks the harbor from its hilltop perch, though in 1885 it's still under construction. The towering Gothic spire that will one day dominate the skyline exists only in architects' drawings. Instead, the old church serves the spiritual needs of those about to undertake the perilous Atlantic crossing. Every Sunday, priests offer special masses for emigrants. Families say their final goodbyes at the church steps, knowing they'll likely never see each other again. The Atlantic passage in 1885 has improved considerably from the nightmare coffin ships of the famine years, but danger still lurks in every crossing. Steam power has reduced the journey from 6 weeks to 10 days, yet this speed creates new hazards. Ships cram more passengers into the same spaces, turning steerage compartments into breeding grounds for disease. Typhus, cholera, smallpox, and ship fever kill thousands annually on immigrant vessels. The SS Erin's Hope appears in Cobh Harbour on April 12, 1885. She's a mid-size passenger steamer, 280 feet long, built in Glasgow in 1871. The vessel has made the Atlantic crossing 43 times without serious incident. Her captain, Jeremiah Donovan, is a Cork native with 20 years' experience on immigrant routes. Local shipping agents consider him reliable, if somewhat rigid in his adherence to company regulations. The Erin's Hope's owners, the Atlantic Steam Navigation Company, operate out of Liverpool. They're a second-tier shipping line, not prestigious like Cunard or White Star, but respectable enough. Their vessels carry emigrants too poor for the premium lines, but not quite desperate enough for the worst operators. The company charges $4 per steerage passenger for the Boston crossing, roughly 3 months' wages for a laborer. Captain Donovan oversees the loading of passengers on April 14th. The manifest records 347 emigrants, 198 adults, 149 children. Most come from counties Cork, Kerry, and Limerick. Farmers forced off their land, agricultural laborers with no work, entire families liquidating everything they own for passage money, young men and women fleeing arranged marriages or social restrictions. Each carries a story of loss, a dream of redemption. The passenger list reveals the human tapestry of late 19th century Irish emigration. The McCarthy family, Patrick, his wife Bridget, and their 6 children aged 3 to 17, from a small farm near Skibbereen. After 3 consecutive crop failures, their landlord issued an eviction notice. America promises land ownership, something denied them in Ireland. Thomas Sheehan, age 19, traveling alone, fleeing accusations of Fenian sympathies after being spotted at a nationalist rally. The widow Mary O'Sullivan, 42, joining her brother in Boston after her husband died in a quarry accident, leaving her destitute. 3 young women from Cork City, Catherine O'Brien, Ellen Murphy, and Margaret Walsh, seeking domestic service positions in American homes, arranged through a hiring agent who promised them $30 annually. The crew totals 22 men. First mate Seamus O'Connell, 38, has sailed with Captain Donovan for 6 years. Ship surgeon Dr. William Pemberton, a Birmingham-trained physician who took to sea medicine after his London practice failed due to drinking. 16 sailors and stokers, mostly English and Scottish, veterans of the Atlantic routes. 2 stewards responsible for the steerage passengers, cook and assistant cook, managing the galley. On April 15th, the Erin's Hope departs Cobh with favorable winds and clear skies. The passengers crowd the rails for a final glimpse of Ireland. Many weep openly. Priests on the dock offer final blessings. The ship's whistle sounds 3 long blasts, a sound that seems to physically tear families apart as the vessel pulls away from the wharf. The crossing begins routinely. Captain Donovan maintains his usual schedule. Up at dawn, rounds of the ship at 6 a.m., 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. He insists on daily inspections of the steerage compartments, checking for signs of disease, unsanitary conditions, or brewing conflicts among passengers. Dr. Pemberton conducts morning sick call, treating seasickness, minor injuries, and chronic conditions. But something is wrong from the start, though no one recognizes it yet. The ship carries an unusually large rat population. Sailors notice them immediately, far more than typical for a vessel of this size. They scurry through the hold at all hours. Passengers complain about rats gnawing their luggage, stealing food, even crawling over sleeping children. The ship's cat, a large orange tabby named Rusty who's made 17 Atlantic crossings, refuses to hunt them. The animal stays in the captain's quarters, agitated and hissing whenever anyone tries to move him below deck. Old sailors consider this a bad omen, but Captain Donovan dismisses such superstition. On April 18th, 3 days into the crossing, the first passenger falls ill. 7-year-old. Connor McCarthy develops a fever. His mother assumes it's seasickness, but Dr. Pemberton recognizes something more serious. The boy's temperature reaches 104 degrees. Red spots appear on his chest and abdomen. The doctor's worst fear materializes: typhus. Typhus fever, also called ship fever, jail fever, or famine fever, has haunted Ireland for generations. The disease spreads through body lice, thriving in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Symptoms begin with fever, headache, and exhaustion, followed by a distinctive rash spreading from the trunk to the limbs. In severe cases, patients become delirious, develop gangrene in their extremities, and die from organ failure or complications. Dr. Pemberton immediately isolates Connor in a makeshift quarantine area, a curtained-off section of steerage. He orders the boy's family to burn their clothing and bedding. He demands the stewards scrub the surrounding area with lye soap and vinegar. But these measures come too late. The disease has already spread. By April 20th, 12 passengers show symptoms. By April 22nd, 28. The disease doesn't discriminate. It strikes children and adults, the healthy and the frail. The steerage compartments become a nightmare of fever and delirium. Patients cry out in their sleep. The distinctive foul odor of typhus, described as like rotting straw, permeates the lower decks. Captain Donovan faces an impossible decision. British and American maritime law requires ships with disease outbreaks to display yellow quarantine flags and proceed to the nearest port for inspection. But Donovan knows what this means. Weeks or months in quarantine. Passengers possibly refused entry to America. Financial ruin for the shipping company. The end of his career. He decides to continue toward Boston, hoping Dr. Pemberton can contain the outbreak. The doctor works tirelessly. He administers what limited medicines he has: laudanum for pain, quinine for fever, purgatives that only weaken patients further. He has passengers' heads shaved to eliminate lice. He orders all bedding and clothing burned. But 1885 medicine can't stop typhus. The disease follows its own trajectory. April 25th brings the first death. Connor McCarthy dies in his mother's arms, his small body consumed by fever. His father, Patrick, constructs a crude coffin from cargo crates. Captain Donovan reads from the Book of Common Prayer as the child's body slips into the Atlantic, sewn into weighted canvas. The family's remaining 5 children watch their brother disappear into the gray water. The deaths accelerate. 2 on April 26th, 4 on April 27th, 5 on April 28th. The crew works around the clock constructing coffins and conducting burials. Captain Donovan's logbook entries grow increasingly terse. April 27th, 4 more dead. Disease spreading despite all efforts. 47 now ill. Crew beginning to show symptoms, God help us. April 29th, lost 6 yesterday, 5 today. Dr. Pemberton exhausted. First mate O'Connell developed fever this morning. More than half passengers, now infected. We are a plague ship. The rats, meanwhile, seem to multiply. They swarm through the ship in unprecedented numbers. They're everywhere, in the galley, the cargo hold, the steerage compartments, even invading the first-class cabins and crew quarters. But strangely, none of them appear sick. They're sleek, fat, and thriving while humans die around them. Dr. Pemberton, working in a fog of exhaustion and mounting horror, makes a disturbing observation in his medical log. The rats show no signs of disease. I've examined several specimens found dead, killed by sailors, and can detect no fever, no weakness, no symptoms of typhus. It's as if they are immune. How can this be? The disease spreads through vermin, yet the vermin themselves remain untouched. On May 1st, Captain Donovan himself falls ill. First mate O'Connell, already deep in fever, can barely function. Command of the ship falls to the second mate, a young Scotsman Med Andrew Wallace, who's never captained a vessel. Wallace finds himself commanding a floating charnel house. The steerage compartments become unbearable. The stench of disease, death, and human waste overwhelms even hardened sailors. Delirious patients wander the corridors. Children cry for parents who lie dying or already dead. The healthy passengers, fewer than 50 by May 2nd, huddle in corners terrified of infection. Dr. Pemberton continues his rounds despite his own declining health. His hands shake, his eyes sink into their sockets, but he refuses to rest. In his journal he writes, "I have failed them all. Every tool of medicine useless, every treatment ineffective. I watch them die and can do nothing. The rats multiply while my patients perish. There is meaning here, but I cannot grasp it." May 3rd marks the breaking point. Second mate Wallace attempts to navigate toward Boston, but he's uncertain of their exact position. The ship's chronometer may be running slow. Dead reckoning becomes guesswork. They might be 2 days from port or 5. Below deck, 60 patients lie in various stages of typhus. 22 have died. The crew is down to 7 functional sailors. That evening, Dr. Pemberton makes his final journal entry. The rats are everywhere now, hundreds, perhaps thousands. They fear nothing. They crawl over the sick, the dying, the dead. But they do not sicken. They thrive. Why do they thrive? What do they know that we don't? In my delirium, for I know I have the fever now, I imagine they watch us with intelligence, with purpose, as if they're waiting for something. God forgive me, I believe they're waiting for us to die. The ship's logbook shows Captain Donovan made his final entry that same day, May 3rd, position uncertain, most crew incapacitated, passengers dying hourly. The rats know something we don't. They're the only ones not getting sick. Wallace will attempt to reach Boston. I feel the fever taking me. God have mercy on us all. Then, silence. What happened in the following 2 weeks remains one of maritime history's most disturbing mysteries. No logbook entries, no witness accounts, no records whatsoever. The ship simply disappeared into the Atlantic fog. The Erin's Hope was expected in Boston on April 27th. When she didn't arrive, harbor officials assumed bad weather had delayed her. By April 30th, concern grew. By May 5th, the Atlantic Steam Navigation Company sent telegrams to ports along the eastern seaboard, asking if anyone had sighted the overdue vessel. On May 8th, a fishing vessel reported seeing a steamer matching the Erin's Hope's description approximately 200 miles east of Boston. The fishermen said the ship appeared to be drifting. They signaled with flags but received no response. The steamer simply continued its slow, aimless course toward the American coast. The fishing captain noted in his log, "Vessel appeared abandoned, saw no crew or passengers. Numerous birds circling the ship." American quarantine officials in Boston, alerted to the possibility of disease aboard, began monitoring the approaches to the harbor. The United States had recently tightened immigrant inspection procedures following cholera outbreaks in several ports. Any ship displaying signs of disease would be immediately quarantined at Long Island or Gallops Island, where passengers would remain isolated until cleared by health inspectors. On May 12th, A lighthouse keeper on Cape Cod spotted the Erin's Hope through his telescope. The vessel drifted in circles approximately 5 miles offshore, apparently rudderless. The lighthouse keeper telegraphed the Coast Guard station in Provincetown. A revenue cutter was dispatched to investigate. The cutter's captain, William Morse, approached the drifting steamer cautiously. He circled the vessel 3 times, calling out through a megaphone. No response. The ship appeared completely lifeless. Morse noted in his report, "Deck entirely empty, sails torn and hanging loose. No smoke from the stack, windows dark, no sign of life aboard. Yet the vessel seemed to move slightly, as if something stirred below." Morse refused to board the ship. Suspecting plague or some other contagion, he towed the Erin's Hope toward Boston, where quarantine officials could examine her properly. The derelict vessel arrived in Boston Harbor on May 14th, creating immediate panic among harbor authorities. Dr. Samuel Kenyon, the senior quarantine officer, organized a boarding party, himself, 2 other physicians, 4 Coast Guard sailors, and a police inspector. They approached the Erin's Hope on May 15th wearing vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs over their faces, the standard, if ineffective, protection against disease. The boarding party climbed onto the silent deck. Dr. Kenyon's report describes the scene. The deck was empty but showed evidence of recent habitation. Ropes lay coiled improperly. A child's doll sat on a hatch cover, cooking pots stood abandoned near the galley, but no people, no bodies, nothing. They descended into the steerage compartments. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The lower decks were destroyed, bedding lay shredded and scattered, trunks and luggage had been torn open, contents strewn everywhere. Clothing, letters, photographs, religious items, the intimate possessions of 347 emigrants, lay in chaos. But no people, no bodies, no blood. The passengers and crew had simply vanished. Dr. Kenyon noticed something else. The distinctive odor of typhus permeated the compartments. And rats. Thousands upon thousands of rats. They covered every surface, the bunks, the floors, the walls. They didn't flee when the investigators entered. They simply watched with black, intelligent eyes. In the captain's quarters, they found Donovan's logbook, medical records, and passenger manifest. The final entries confirmed the typhus outbreak and hinted at the catastrophic mortality rate. But where were the bodies? Maritime law required burial at sea, but with 347 passengers and 22 crew, even a complete die-off would have left at least a few corpses, the most recently deceased, or those who died after the crew became too weak to conduct burials. The galley provided another disturbing clue. Someone had consumed food recently, within the past few days, based on the freshness of crumbs and scraps. But who? If any survivors remained, where had they gone? In the cargo hold, investigators found more chaos. Crates had been broken open. Food supplies, salt pork, dried beans, flour, had been torn apart and scattered. The rats had clearly feasted on the provisions. But the pattern of destruction suggested something more deliberate than simple vermin infestation. Dr. Kenyon examined several dead rats found in the hold. His autopsy report notes, the specimens appear remarkably healthy. No signs of disease, well fed with thick coats and healthy organs. It's as if they thrived while everyone else died. The most disturbing discovery came in the orlop deck, the lowest level of the ship. There, in the dimmest, dampest corner, someone had scratched words into the wooden planking. The handwriting was barely legible, carved by fingernails or perhaps a piece of broken glass. The rats knew first. They didn't get sick. We thought the disease came from them, but it came from us. We are the disease. Below that, in different handwriting, they're waiting, patient. They know we can't last. They've already won. And finally, a third hand, this one shaky and barely readable. Don't touch the dead. The rats won't touch the dead. Why won't they touch the dead? The boarding party searched for 2 hours. They found no bodies, no survivors, no explanation. 369 human beings had simply disappeared from a locked vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Dr. Kenyon ordered the ship towed to Gallup's Island, a quarantine station in Boston Harbor. He initiated a full investigation, bringing in additional medical experts, police detectives, and maritime officials. The case quickly attracted international attention. Newspapers seized on the mystery. The Boston Globe published a headline on May 17th, "Ghost ship arrives in harbor. 347 Irish emigrants vanished. Only rats remain alive." The New York Times followed with, "Mystery of the Erin's Hope, typhus plague ship found empty. What happened to the passengers?" Theories proliferated. Some suggested the passengers had been taken off by another vessel, but why would that ship leave no record? Others proposed mass suicide, but where were the bodies? A few sensationalist papers hinted at sea monsters or supernatural forces. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. This investigation is about to take an even darker turn. Share this with someone who loves dark maritime mysteries. Let's discover what happens next, and I promise you, the truth is stranger than anything you've imagined. The breakthrough came on May 19th, when a maintenance worker at Gallup's Island made a horrifying discovery while inspecting the Erin's Hope's bilge, the lowest part of the ship's hull where water collects. Thomas Chen, a Chinese immigrant employed by the quarantine station, descended into the bilge with a lantern to check for leaks. The space was cramped, dark, and filled with several feet of stagnant water. As Chen waded through the filth, his foot struck something soft and yielding. He brought his lantern lower. There, beneath the water's surface, he glimpsed pale flesh, a human arm, then another and another. Chen scrambled out of the bilge, shouting for help. Within an hour, a team of investigators began the grim task of pumping out the bilge water and examining what lay beneath. They found bodies, dozens of them, packed into the bilge space, piled atop one another, compressed into the narrow gap between the ship's inner and outer hulls. As the water level dropped, more corpses emerged. Men, women, children, their bodies in varying states of decomposition. Dr. Kenyon oversaw the recovery operation. His official report describes it clinically. We recovered 127 bodies from the bilge and hull spaces. The corpses showed signs of typhus infection, the characteristic rash, signs of fever-related tissue damage. But many also showed trauma inconsistent with disease, broken bones, crushed skulls, injuries suggesting violence or deliberate harm. The bodies had been hidden intentionally. Someone had stuffed corpses into every available space below the waterline, the bilge, behind hull planking, in the chain locker, even in the water tanks. The effort required would have been enormous, suggesting multiple people working over days or even weeks. But 127 bodies left 242 people unaccounted for. Where were the rest? The investigation team expanded their search. They dismantled parts of the ship, tore up floorboards, examined every compartment. On May 21st, they made another discovery in the cargo hold. Behind stacked crates, they found a space that had been deliberately sealed with boards and canvas. When they broke through, the smell that emerged made even experienced investigators retch. Inside the sealed space lay more bodies, 83 this time, stacked like cordwood, in much worse condition than those in the bilge. Dr. Kenyon's autopsy reports revealed disturbing patterns. Many of the victims showed signs of having died from typhus, but others displayed evidence of starvation, dehydration, or physical trauma. Several children appeared to have been smothered. At least a dozen adults showed defensive wounds on their hands and arms. Most disturbing, some bodies bore bite marks. Small, precise bite marks. Rat bites. Thousands of them. One victim, later identified as Dr. William Pemberton based on the physician's instruments found nearby, had been almost entirely consumed by rats, with only bones and some tissue remaining. The forensic evidence suggested something horrifying had unfolded. Aboard the Erin's Hope. As typhus spread and people died, the survivors had hidden the bodies rather than conducting proper burials. Why? Dr. Kenyon theorized that by the time the disease reached its peak, the crew was too weak to perform the physically demanding task of weighted sea burial. Hiding bodies in the bilge and hold required less effort than hauling them topside and overboard. But this didn't explain the violence. It didn't explain the crushed skulls and broken bones. It didn't explain why some apparently healthy people, those showing no signs of disease, had been killed and hidden with the plague victims. On May 24th, investigators searching the captain's quarters found a hidden journal, not the official logbook, but a personal diary kept by first mate Seamus O'Connell. The entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, provided the first glimpse into what had happened after May 3rd. May 4th. Captain Donovan died this morning. Wallace attempts to command, but he's terrified and incompetent. Half the passengers dead. Disease spreading to crew. Dr. Pemberton raves about the rats. Says they're immune. Says they're multiplying. I've seen them too. They seem to watch us. May 5th. Wallace ordered burial of bodies, but we're too weak. We dragged 12 corpses to the bilge instead. Easier than lifting them over the rail. God forgive us. The rats feast on the dead. May 7th, fighting broke out in steerage. Healthy passengers trying to seal off the sick. 3 men died in the struggle, not from disease, from violence. We're animals now. The rats watch everything with black eyes. May 9th, Wallace dead, ship drifting, maybe 20 still alive. The healthy ones have barricaded themselves in the forward compartment. They've sealed the sick in steerage to die. I hear screaming through the walls, can't help them, can barely move myself. May 11th, the rats are in control now. They're everywhere, thousands. They don't fear us anymore. They crawl over the living as readily as the dead. I think they're waiting for us to finish dying. Dr. Pemberton was right, they knew something we didn't. May 12th, found Dr. Pemberton's body. The rats had eaten most of him. Watched them for an hour. They work with terrible efficiency, I understand now. We're just food to them. We always were. All our dreams, our plans, our prayers, meaningless. The rats will inherit the ship. The journal ended there. O'Connell's body was found among those in the sealed cargo space, showing signs of advanced typhus. But 32 people remained unaccounted for. The ship had carried 369 souls. Investigators had recovered 210 bodies. Where were the final 32? The answer came on June 3rd, when a fishing boat off Cape Cod hauled in their nets and found them tangled with human remains. Over the following weeks, more bodies washed ashore along the Massachusetts coast, bloated, partially decomposed, showing signs of typhus and drowning. The forensic evidence told a final, desperate story. In the last days aboard the Erin's Hope, as the ship drifted toward the American coast, the few surviving passengers and crew, perhaps believing they'd be quarantined indefinitely or sent back to Ireland, had chosen to abandon ship. They'd jumped or been pushed into the Atlantic, preferring a quick death in the sea to a slow death from disease or rats. By mid-June, the body count reached 241. The final 128 were never recovered, presumably lost to the Atlantic or consumed by scavengers. Every passenger who'd boarded in Cobh on April 14th was dead. Every crew member was dead. Of the 369 souls who'd set sail with dreams of new lives in America, not one survived. The only survivors were the rats. The Erin's Hope disaster sparked immediate controversy on both sides of the Atlantic. American officials demanded answers. How had a plague ship been allowed to depart Ireland? Why hadn't it been quarantined at the first port? Who was responsible for this floating catastrophe? British authorities launched a formal inquiry in June 1885, headed by Sir Charles Cameron, Chief Medical Officer for Dublin. The investigation examined the Atlantic Steam Navigation Company's practices, Captain Donovan's decisions, and the broader system of emigrant ship regulation. The inquiry revealed systematic failures at every level. The Atlantic Steam Navigation Company had a history of overcrowding vessels and ignoring health regulations. The Erin's Hope should have carried 280 passengers maximum, but had been loaded with 347, a 24 overload. This crowding created ideal conditions for disease transmission. The company had also failed to properly fumigate the ship between voyages. Investigators discovered that the vessel's last crossing, completed in March 1885, had also experienced a minor typhus outbreak. 3 passengers died during that voyage. The ship should have been thoroughly cleaned and disinfected before taking on new passengers. Instead, it had been briefly washed and immediately returned to service. The rat infestation traced back to this negligence. Typhus-carrying lice can survive in rat fur and ship's cargo. The March outbreak had seeded the ship with disease. The rats, immune to typhus but carriers of the lice, multiplied rapidly in the unsanitary conditions of the overloaded vessel. By the time the April crossing began, the ship was a floating incubator. Captain Donovan's decision to continue toward Boston, rather than returning to Cobh or diverting to another port, came under particular scrutiny. Maritime law clearly required quarantine at the nearest port. Donovan had violated this law, prioritizing his company's financial interests over passenger safety. But the inquiry also revealed the impossible pressures captains faced. The Atlantic Steam Navigation Company's internal documents, seized by investigators, showed that captains who diverted ships for quarantine were penalized financially and often dismissed. Donovan had watched his predecessor lose his position after quarantining a vessel in Halifax. The system incentivized captains to hide disease and press on regardless of danger. The inquiry concluded in September 1885 with a scathing report. The loss of life aboard the SS Erin's Hope resulted from a combination of corporate negligence, regulatory failure, and systematic disregard for passenger welfare. The Atlantic Steam Navigation Company prioritized profit over human life. Captain Donovan, though culpable for his decisions, operated within a system that punished prudence and rewarded recklessness. Legal proceedings proved complex. The Atlantic Steam Navigation Company faced criminal charges of negligent homicide and civil lawsuits from victims' families. But the company's limited liability structure, common among shipping companies of the era, protected its owners from personal responsibility. The company declared bankruptcy in October 1885, dissolved its assets, and ceased operations. The owners faced no jail time and retained their personal fortunes. Victims' families received minimal compensation. A hastily organized relief fund raised $3,200, approximately 9 per victim. Most families, already impoverished, received a single payment that barely covered funeral costs for the bodies that were recovered. The British government responded with the Merchant Shipping Act Amendment of 1886, which strengthened health regulations for emigrant vessels. Ships were required to carry certified medical officers, maintain minimum sanitary standards, and submit to pre-voyage health inspections. Passenger limits were strictly enforced with heavy fines for violations. Captains who failed to quarantine diseased vessels faced criminal prosecution. These reforms came too late for the Erin's Hope victims, but they did improve conditions on subsequent crossings. Typhus deaths on immigrant ships dropped by 60% over the following decade. The fate of the Erin's Hope herself became another controversy. The ship sat at Gallops Island, Q. Tyne Station for 6 months, while authorities debated what to do with it. Some proposed burning it, others suggested thorough disinfection and return to service. Maritime unions demanded the ship be destroyed as a cursed vessel. The decision was taken out of human hands. On November 23, 1885, during a fierce Atlantic storm, the Erin's Hope broke her moorings at Gallops Island and drifted into Boston Harbor. Before tugs could reach her, the vessel ran aground on shag rocks near the harbor entrance. The hull breached. Within hours, the ship broke apart and sank. Salvage attempts recovered some cargo and metal fittings, but the wooden hull was left where it lay. The wreck remained visible at low tide for decades, a grim reminder of the disaster. Local fishermen avoided the area, claiming the wreck was haunted. They reported seeing lights moving inside the submerged hull at night and hearing sounds like voices crying out over the water. The rat population aboard the Erin's Hope presented a final problem. When investigators first boarded the vessel, they estimated several thousand rats infested the ship. Quarantine officials attempted to eradicate them using poison, traps, and fumigation, but the rats proved remarkably resilient. Dr. Kenyon conducted a study of the Erin's Hope rats, collecting specimens for examination. His research, published in the American Journal of Public Health in 1886, revealed something extraordinary. The rats showed unusual resistance to disease. When deliberately exposed to typhus-infected materials, they remained healthy. Their immune systems appeared to have adapted to the disease environment. Kenyon theorized that the rats had evolved resistance over multiple generations aboard typhus-infected ships. Natural selection favored rats with stronger immune responses. Over time, entire rat populations aboard emigrant vessels became disease-resistant supercarriers, immune to the diseases themselves, but perfect vectors for transmitting them to humans. This research contributed to the eventual understanding that typhus spreads through lice, not rats directly. But the Erin's Hope rats demonstrated how disease ecosystems could develop aboard ships, creating conditions where vermin thrived while humans perished. Some rats from the Erin's Hope escaped into the Boston waterfront before the ship sank. For years afterward, Boston authorities dealt with an unusually disease-resistant rat population in the Harbor District. Typhus cases in Boston's immigrant neighborhoods increased by 30% between 1886 and 1888, possibly linked to the escaped rats. The human stories behind the disaster emerged slowly. Newspapers tracked down relatives of victims, publishing their testimonials and photographs. These personal accounts revealed the full tragedy, not just the deaths, but the lost futures, the abandoned dreams, the families shattered by loss. Patrick McCarthy, who'd watched his son Connor die early in the outbreak, left behind a wife and 5 other children in Skibbereen. His widow Nora never recovered emotionally from losing her entire family. She died in 1887, essentially of grief, according to her death certificate. The McCarthy farm reverted to the landlord and was rented to a new tenant. Thomas Sheehan, the young man fleeing Fenian accusations, was buried in an unmarked grave in Boston after his body washed ashore in late May. His family in Ireland received word of his death 3 months later. His mother carried his photograph until her own death in 1903. The widow Mary O'Sullivan never reached her brother in Boston. Her body was among those recovered from the bilge. Her brother spent 2 years trying to bring her remains back to Ireland for proper burial, but couldn't afford the cost. She was buried in a mass grave at Gallops Island with 37 other unidentified Erin's Hope victims. The 3 young women seeking domestic service, Catherine O'Brien, Ellen Murphy, and Margaret Walsh, died together in the sea. Lead cargo compartment. Evidence suggested they'd survived until at least May 10th before succumbing to typhus. Their families in Cork erected a memorial stone in St. Finbarr's Cemetery, though their bodies remained in America. First mate Seamus O'Connell's widow Maureen successfully sued the Atlantic Steam Navigation Company for loss of income. She received $150 in the bankruptcy settlement, enough to live on for perhaps 2 years. She returned to her family farm in Kerry and never remarried. Dr. William Pemberton's family in Birmingham initially denied he'd been aboard the Erin's Hope, ashamed of his decline into ship's medicine. When his body was identified through his medical instruments, they refused to claim it. He was buried at Gallup's Island in the mass grave. Captain Jeremiah Donovan became the primary scapegoat in popular memory. Newspapers depicted him as a villain who'd prioritized profit over lives, but his family defended him vigorously. His daughter, Margaret Donovan, published a pamphlet in 1887 titled The Truth About My Father, arguing that corporate pressure had forced his decisions. The pamphlet had little impact on public opinion. The disaster affected Cobh itself profoundly. The town's economy depended on immigrant traffic, but the Erin's Hope catastrophe made potential emigrants wary of departing from the port. Bookings dropped 40% in 1886. Local businesses suffered. The town's reputation as a safe departure point was permanently damaged. A memorial service held in Cobh on November 15, 1885, 6 months after the ship's departure, drew over 5,000 mourners. The Bishop of Cork presided over a mass at the waterfront. A local stonemason donated a memorial plaque, installed at the wharf where the Erin's Hope had departed. The plaque read, "In memory of the 369 souls who departed this port on April 15, 1885, aboard the SS Erin's Hope, bound for Boston. None reached their destination. May they rest in the arms of God." The plaque remained at the Cobh waterfront until it was removed during port renovations in 1923. Its current location is unknown. The SS Erin's Hope disaster had lasting effects on maritime law, public health policy, and immigration regulation that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Most significantly, the disaster accelerated the development of international maritime health standards. Before 1885, each nation maintained its own quarantine regulations with little coordination. Ships could evade one country's rules by sailing to another. The Erin's Hope case demonstrated that disease knew no borders. A plague ship threatened every port it approached. In 1887, representatives from 12 maritime nations met in Venice for the first international sanitary conference focused specifically on shipborne disease. The conference established baseline standards for passenger ship sanitation, mandatory medical inspections, and quarantine procedures. While enforcement remained weak, the conference marked the beginning of international cooperation on maritime public health. These standards evolved into the International Sanitary Regulations of 1892, which required all passenger ships to carry certified medical officers, maintain minimum ventilation and sanitation standards, and report disease outbreaks immediately to port authorities. Ships that violated these regulations could be banned from international ports. The disaster also influenced American immigration policy during a critical period of debate about who should be admitted to the United States. The 1880s saw increasing calls for immigration restriction, driven by economic concerns, ethnic prejudice, and public health fears. The Erin's Hope catastrophe provided powerful ammunition for restrictionists. Congressman Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, a leading restrictionist, cited the disaster in congressional debates. The Erin's Hope shows us that unregulated immigration brings not just poverty and crime but disease and death we must protect American ports from becoming graveyards for foreign plagues. This rhetoric contributed to the passage of the Immigration Act of 1891, which federalized immigration control and established the Office of Immigration, later the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The act gave federal officials power to reject immigrants deemed likely to become public charges or those carrying disease. Medical inspections at ports of entry became more rigorous. The disaster also highlighted the brutal economics of 19th-century immigrant transport. Shipping companies operated on razor-thin profit margins. Overcrowding was standard practice. Safety regulations were routinely violated. Emigrants, desperate to escape poverty, had little bargaining power and few legal protections. Labor unions and progressive reformers used the Erin's Hope case to advocate for passenger rights. The Seamen's Union Journal published a series of articles in 1886 exposing conditions aboard immigrant ships. Irish-American organizations lobbied for stronger protections for emigrants. These efforts contributed to gradual improvements in passenger welfare standards over the following decades. The case also raised troubling questions about disease ecology that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The rat's immunity to typhus while serving as vectors for lice carrying the disease illustrated the complex relationship between humans, animals, and pathogens. This understanding would prove crucial in later public health campaigns. Dr. Kenyon's research on the Erin's Hope rats influenced Charles Nicoll's eventual discovery that typhus spreads through body lice, not directly from person to person. Nicoll's 1909 breakthrough, which earned him the Nobel Prize in 1928, led to effective typhus control measures, hygiene improvements, and eventually DDT treatment during World War II. The disaster's impact on understanding of disease transmission extended beyond typhus. It demonstrated that overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition created conditions where diseases could devastate entire populations. This lesson would inform public health responses to tuberculosis, cholera, and other epidemic diseases in urban immigrant communities. The Erin's Hope also entered Irish cultural memory as a symbol of the continued suffering of emigrants even after the Great Famine. Folk songs commemorated the disaster. A ballad called The Ghost Ship of Cobh circulated in Irish communities in America and Ireland, telling the story of the lost emigrants. They sailed from Cobh on a spring day bright, 300 souls with hope in sight. But fever came on the ocean wide, and all were lost to the cold Atlantic tide. The disaster reinforced Irish mistrust of British authorities and shipping companies. Many Irish saw the Erin's Hope not as a tragic accident, but as another example of British negligence toward Irish lives. This perception fed into the nationalist movement's narrative of British oppression. Interestingly, the disaster also influenced maritime superstition. The phrase ghost ship became associated with the Erin's Hope, and sailors began using it to describe any vessel that appeared abandoned or cursed. The image of a ship crewed only by rats entered maritime folklore, and later appeared in literature and film. The case raised profound questions about corporate responsibility that remain relevant today. The Atlantic Steam Navigation Company evaded accountability through bankruptcy and limited liability structures. The owners faced no personal consequences despite their systematic violations of safety regulations. Victims' families received minimal compensation while company principals retained their wealth. This pattern repeated across industries in the 19th century. Corporate entities could commit grave harms while shielding individual decision-makers from responsibility. The Erin's Hope case contributed to ongoing debates about corporate liability, workers' rights, and consumer protection that would eventually lead to stronger regulatory frameworks in the 20th century. The disaster also illuminated class dynamics in Victorian society. The immigrants who died were poor farmers, laborers, and servants, people considered expendable by the economic system of the era. Their deaths sparked far less outrage than a comparable disaster affecting wealthier passengers would have. The media coverage, while extensive, often depicted the victims as helpless, ignorant peasants rather than individuals with agency and dreams. This class bias appeared in official responses too. The investigation was thorough, but the legal consequences were minimal. Compare this to disasters involving upper-class victims, which typically resulted in stricter punishment and more substantial compensation. The Erin's Hope case demonstrated how Victorian society valued lives differently based on social class. Finally, the disaster contributed to evolving understanding of psychological trauma. Survivors of maritime disasters, those who watched ships sink or witnessed mass death, often suffered what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The investigators who boarded the Erin's Hope and recovered bodies reported nightmares, anxiety, and depression for years afterward. Dr. Kenyon wrote in his private correspondence about his ongoing distress, "I see those bodies every time I close my eyes, the rats watching us, the messages scratched into the wood. I am a physician trained to confront death clinically, yet this has broken something in me." Several members of the investigation team left public service within 2 years, citing health reasons. We now understand they likely suffered from trauma-related mental health conditions. Their experiences foreshadowed the recognition of PTSD in soldiers, disaster workers, and others exposed to traumatic events. The SS Erin's Hope remains one of history's most haunting maritime disasters. 369 people boarded that ship with dreams of new lives. None survived. The only witnesses to their final days were rats, creatures that thrived while humans perished. What do you think drove this catastrophe? Was it corporate greed, systemic failure, or simple tragic circumstances? Did Captain Donovan make an impossible choice, or did he commit unforgivable negligence? Leave your theories in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of maritime history compelling, subscribe to the Silent Abbey for more lost stories that textbooks won't touch. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into history's darkest corners. The wreck of the Erin's Hope still lies on shag rocks in Boston Harbor. At low tide, pieces of the hull remain visible. Local divers report an unusual number of rats living in the rocks around the wreck site, descendants, perhaps, of the only survivors. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another mystery that history tried to bury